Hello and welcome to my final major project presentation. Thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this. Hope you enjoy. The first step of my development process was research, in the form of a literature review. I needed to understand the basic principles of what makes something scary, ranging from phobias to game design theory. Doing in-depth research prevents me falling into a common misconception of horrors only being scary due to jump scares. A focus point from the literature review was the fear of the predator. This essentially means there is always a common monster or creature that people are scared of. When starting to think about my game, I knew that I wanted something that would scare the player and chase them to get their heart racing. When being chased, the player would go into a state of predator-induced fear, therefore triggering a fight or flight response. Within a split second, they would have to choose where to hide or how to combat this monster. Uncanny Valley is the concept of something looking similar to a human or having human-like features, but because you know it isn't, gives it a haunting persona. This is similar to what players experience when they encounter the Wendigo in the game Until Dawn, which has human-like features but they have been exaggerated with the intent to scare players. For example, longer limbs and larger mouth. The final focus point that I took from the literature review was scale, which is an important factor when creating an immersive environment. Can either make or break the realism that the player feels when playing a game. Horror games tend to have a realistic scale, making the player feel more immersed. However, scale of things such as objects and creatures can be altered to make them feel more menacing. For example, in the game Little Nightmares, the monsters that you face in the environment the player walks through have increased scale, making the player feel unfit to face the monsters with the only option to hide. After doing enough research to be satisfied, I already had an idea in mind for a game, so I quickly got to writing down my initial thoughts in an elevator pitch. This states what the game will be about and sheds light on what game design field I'll be focusing on, which was level design. Once my initial idea was jotted down, I needed to narrow it down and have a clearer picture on the game I wanted to make. To do this, I made a one-sheet that has a summary of all the necessary information contained within it. This includes the base story, enemies, and core mechanics. It also includes further information like the demographic, platform, and the genre. Having this one sheet to refer back to makes sure I don't stray too far from the original idea and the scope of the game. Having a solid game idea made it easier for me to make decisions on how I wanted my game to play. So I looked at games that mainly revolve around stealth and then incorporated their ideas into my gameplay loop. This gameplay loop will keep me on track for the basis of my game and will further ensure I don't stray too far from my original idea. Dishonored was one of my references that I took inspiration from when planning out my game. Even though you can go in guns blazing, it's mainly centered around stealth and often requires you to take the higher ground to sneak past your enemies. As a level designer, I couldn't just focus on the gameplay of my level, so I created a second loop that my levels would abide by, ensuring consistency throughout my game. Within my game, I wanted the players to be able to sneak around the hostile mutants, not face them head on. To help ease this process, I created a survival sense mechanic, which allows the player to see the mutant through the walls and also highlight environmental objects that the player can hide behind. I made the base of it a dusty colour as it blends in quite well with a Victorian steampunk environment. After testing my survival sense in my level, I realised that having it boundless would cause a lot of issues, as you could see the enemies through the whole map. So I went back and made the radius smaller so that the player would have to be in closer proximity to see them through walls. From the previous version of the survival sense, I replaced the dusty look with a grey base as the dusty colour was clashing with the colours in my level. I also removed the fade out from the sense to make it just snap out, as the fade out was making the enemies permanently visible through the walls. This is my survival sense mechanic that I created on my character blueprint. I started by making an input action on the letter Z, followed by a flip-flop as I wanted the player to be able to toggle it on and off at will. After toggled, a breathe in or breathe out sound will play to give the player some feedback from the game. Shortly after, a timeline slowly changes the scalar parameter over 1 second. While inside my blueprint setup, I created my sense material. Firstly, it contains the overall sense, which holds the colours of enemies, the environment and friendlies. Moving on, it holds the world colour, which consists of the base grey colour you've seen in the last video and a black outline which separates it from the actual environment colour. Lastly, it holds the radius, which determines how far the survival sense will affect the environment. Once I had made the material, I then proceeded to create an instance of it, which allowed me to change the variables of the material without having to open it back up and hard-coded it in. Once the instance was in place, I could select on an object and change the custom depth stencil value to make it show one of the colours created in my material, once Z was pressed. To encompass the fear of the predator that I mentioned during my literature review, I wanted big hulking enemies that would patrol around my level. I scaled them up to be larger than the player to make them appear more intimidating as they approach or walk by. Instead of the enemy just floating, I decided to use an animation off of Mixamo to improve the player experience. Once I had the patrolling in place, I wanted the creature to be able to see the player and chase them, which adds to their scare factor. Once again, I added an animation to the creature to make it more realistic when running, and a swiper attack to ensure it looks like it's hitting the player. Once the player gets hit, the character falls to the ground, which enforces the feeling of getting hit. In my game, I wanted instant death, so this animation setup was perfect for me, as it portrays the character instantly dying after being hit by this huge monster. Originally, the idea was to have multiple mutants roaming around in this level. However, that didn't give the player any chance to explore or interact with some of the events in the environment, so now only one loops around. Now that I had all the animations and patrol points set up, I added footsteps to the mutant so that it would create more fear when walking around. This also allows the player to hear that it's coming and gives them chance to slip away. After creating the initial chaser mechanic, I knew that wasn't going to be enough to scare the player, so I added an initial grunt from the monster to indicate to the player that they've been spotted. Louder footsteps are also added, as footsteps are usually louder when running. Once the player is caught and hit by the mutant, an added sound will play, further indicating that they've been hit. Shortly after, a death screen will blur out the background and allow the player to restart the mission or return to the main menu. The clip currently playing shows the final blueprint for my mutant. The patrolling system is made up of AI move to functions with locations that can be swapped out at any time. However, before moving through them, it first checks to see if the mutant is currently chasing the player. If not, it continues patrolling. In the event of seeing the player using the pawn sensing function, the mutant will start heading to wherever the player is located. If the mutant reaches the player, it will play the animation once, and straight after the death screen will be created and added to the viewport. When creating my teleport mechanic, I wanted it to roughly resemble the blink ability from Dishonored. However, I had to consider scope as I was mainly focusing level design rather than scripting. So at first I devised a simple walking teleporter that transports the player from one location to another. Once I had the premise of my teleporter set up, I decided I wanted the player to be able to interact with the teleporter, allowing them more control. So when they step into it, they will get a notification that pops up telling them to press the button F, which then allows them to teleport. For the final touches on my teleport mechanic, I changed the interaction pop-up to the F key. I made it out of pipes on Photoshop to try and stick to the steampunk theme. Once the player teleports, a black vignette appears around their screen identifying that they have teleported. Furthermore, I added a particle emitter that gets created after they teleported, that portrays the character's body gets electrified when they teleport. This clip shows the blueprint I made, which makes the interaction pop-up appear after stepping into the trigger for the teleporter. Once the player steps into the trigger, the teleporter widget is added to the viewport and the animation plays on the widget to make it flash, urging the player to press it. Once the player steps out of the trigger box, the widget is removed from the screen. I wanted the player to teleport back and forth, so the F key was put into a flip-flop. Once the F key is pressed when standing inside the trigger box, the player will be teleported to one of the designated locations after playing an electric sound, followed by the vignette. I've set the system up so that this process happens either way the player teleports. Instead of having my project just open up into my level, I decided to make a main menu. This is the first thing that players see when they play a game, so I wanted mine to fit my theme of horror, so I tried my best to make it feel creepy with a broken light and a creature lurking in the back. For the final version of my main menu, the first thing I changed was the lighting due to user feedback, as they were saying it was too hard to look at. I also changed the colour to red, as I think it represents more danger. A film grain was added to the camera to make the footage look old. The creature was moved to the centre and placed in a vat that I modelled in Maya. I put them here as they are the main enemy of the game. Once the player has loaded up the game and pressed play, they are greeted with an intro sequence. This passage tells the story of the world and what happened to it, and really sets the scene for the player. They can choose to skip it if they don't want to read it. After the introductory passage, the player is introduced to a corridor. Sounds were added to the player's footsteps to create a sense of realism and immersion. The player can interact with some doors, which when opened play an animation and a sound which adds further immersion. The door sound was picked because they are meant to be heavy old mechanical doors from a steampunk era. This is the first encounter that the player gets with a mutant in this prototype. Unknowing what they are, the player proceeds forward, finding another way past the locked door. A pop-up indicates to the player to crouch through into the service tunnel. I used red lighting to indicate an emergency situation and to lead the player through. To give the player a sense of elevation in my level, I used my teleport mechanic in the service tunnel. Upon exiting the service tunnel, the player is greeted with another pop-up which teaches them about my survival sense mechanic, which allows them to see the space clearer. In this room I kept the lighting very minimal, with the main lights highlighting the vats, which is where the mutants were made. I tried to use the game design theory called leading lines within this room, with all the platforms being straight, and with two paths either side, it leads the player straight to the other door. The player can use the environment to their advantage and hide from the mutant. As you can see, my survival sense has highlighted an ideal hiding spot for the player. The player can approach this event in this room, which adds more environmental storytelling within my level. I made the switches on the doors that can be opened green. This indicates to the player that they can go through here, which can also be classed as the leading light. When approaching this larger door, the player is greeted by another pop-up, which suggests to them that the door is locked and they must find another way around. The other door to the left has a green light on it, which draws the player to that door. When reaching the end of the room, a red light draws the player into the vent, preceding them through the level. Since this was a prototype, I wanted the final cutscene to get the player ready for the next part of the game, which shows the mad scientist that was stated in the opening dialogue. Originally my idea was to create a hexagonal inspired space within Unreal, however it resembled that of a sci-fi space genre. After this I researched into steampunk environments and found they had more curvature within them. Although I had found this, I would need to abide by the steampunk theme, and there was no possible way I could achieve this curvature from Unreal blockout tools. Once realising about the curvature of the steampunk environments, I opened up Maya, as this gives me access to modelling tools that will help me achieve what I am looking for. I began by making the initial corridor have a curved roof and doorways you would find in a steampunk environment. Later on, I realised the topology on my corridor wasn't quite right, so I went back and fixed that. After that, I began to model my service tunnels, which I duplicated and placed where I needed them. I kept the floors and roofs separate, however combined the walls. This allowed me easy access into the indoor space, allowing me to add details. By doing this, it also achieves a sense of modularity, which then allows me to move them to other areas I need them. The starting point was now established for the player. I moved on to one of the main rooms of my level, the VAT room. I carried on the curved roof feature as it ensures consistency throughout the level. Before cracking on with the interior of the VAT room, I knew I wanted a bit of elevation in my level, so I moved one of the service tunnels on top of the other, which would require the player to teleport up to. Plotting out this area was the first step to make the environment feel realistic. Keeping in mind leading lines, I started adding my details to this area but making sure not to cover those two central paths. I also made sure to add areas where the player could hide from the mutant. To cut up tension and to build it back up, I built a longer corridor leading up to the final room. To create some environmental storytelling, I moved around some of the tables and chairs I created to show that people might have rushed off in a panic. Once I had all my level created in Maya, created to realistic scale it with the help of the UE5 mannequin, I then built it in Unreal Engine 5. Due to most of my level being modular, that process was quite easy, as most of the pieces slotted together. Originally I was planning on lighting my level with ambient lighting as you could see in the first image. However, I felt that didn't really give it an old steampunk feel, so I changed to more solid lighting emitting from hanging lights with a yellowish tinge. By also using an emissive material, it makes the light source feel more realistic. Having red lights above the doors also provides guides to the player on where to head towards. Overall, I think the whole process went rather smoothly. However, I found myself focusing more on the scripting aspects of the mechanics. Doing so, this led to not as much time as I'd hoped for on my level. In hindsight, I should have spent less time on the mechanics and had them even simpler, which would have offered me more time to focus on my level, possibly adding 1 or 2 more rooms to my level, where mutants would roam around offering more challenge to the player. Time management is a problem I'm facing ever more, as I find myself running out of time for the things I want to implement. Even though it's a problem for me, I have been slowly improving on it, and it has become less of an issue for me in this project. I will continue to work on this throughout my projects and work. Regarding this project, I will continue to work in Maya and add more environmental detail and create a few more rooms to offer more challenge to the player. Thank you for taking time out of your day to follow along with my design process. Hope you enjoyed.